Okay, so here's the story. And where we're going to pick up the story is after the betrayal of Jesus by another one of Jesus' followers, after Jesus was mocked and he went through a sham trial and the kangaroo court declared him guilty, even though he wasn't, and everyone knew he wasn't guilty. And then he was tortured, and then he was crucified. So that's Friday, that's Good Friday that we call it, the day that Jesus died. And the story picks up right after Good Friday, right after the crucifixion. So we're going to look at verse 57. As evening approached, Jesus is now dead. Joseph, this is not Jesus' stepdad. He appears to have been dead by this point. This is another Joseph. He was a rich man from Arimathea who had become a follower of Jesus. He went to Pilate, who was the governor, so he's obviously an important guy if he can go directly to the governor, and he asked for Jesus' body. And Pilate issued an order to release it to him. Joseph took the body, this is the body of Jesus, and he wrapped it in a long sheet of clean linen cloth. He placed it in his own new tomb, which had been carved out of the rock. Then he rolled, what did he roll? A great stone across the entrance. Okay, now this is interesting, and we get the details here in Matthew. Often, I think we grow up believing that the stone was placed there by Jesus' enemies. But in fact, the truth is, the stone was placed by one of Jesus' friends, by one of his followers, which makes you perhaps scratch your head and say, why did this guy place that stone? Before we get to the why, let me tell you a little bit more about this guy. Another gospel account gives us some detail about Joseph, and I want to read for you what Luke says about him. There was a good and righteous man named Joseph. He was a member of the Jewish High Council, but he had not agreed with the decisions and actions of the other religious leaders. Okay, so what we just found out is the guy who placed the stone was actually a member of the Supreme Court of his day. The Jewish Supreme Court was called the Sanhedrin. It was comprised of 70 judges. Joseph was one of the 70. Now, on this day, what was the most recent court case they had heard? The Supreme Court of that day had just heard a court case. It was Jesus of Nazareth v. Jewish leaders. And guess who won? The Jewish leaders. And Joseph's own high court had just sentenced Jesus to death. And so here's a member of that court, and I can only imagine as he's asking for the body and then taking the body of Jesus and wrapping it and preparing it for burial, I can only imagine what was going through his mind. Now, let me just give you a disclaimer. I have not talked to Joseph personally. He has not told me. But I can only imagine as he's dealing with this wrecked and broken and bloody body of his leader, the one that he had followed maybe from a distance. I can only imagine what was going through his mind. I can only imagine him thinking, man, if only I had spent more time with this guy. I had no idea at 33 years it'd be over this quick. Right? If only I had given more to his cause. If only I had defended him better in front of the court earlier today. Could I have stopped this? Could I have made a difference? Now, I don't know his heart. I don't know the guilt, the sadness that he might have been wrestling with. But I have to wonder, as he did this final act of burial where he wrapped Jesus' body and then he placed it in the tomb, and then you see him taking this large stone and rolling it across the face of the tomb. I just wonder what he was dealing with in that moment. I wonder if there was a part of him that was struggling with giving up on God. Let me ask you, have you ever given up on God? Right, and what I notice about Joseph as he's preparing the body of Jesus is he's doing this permanent ritual of burial. And so all of the wounds of Jesus there was no one who saw him closer that day than Joseph. Joe saw them because he's literally taking the body of Jesus. Jesus had been crucified naked. He's taking it and he's trying to treat it with honor and respect, and he's wrapping it up. But he would have seen the holes through Jesus' feet. He would have seen the holes in his hands. He would have seen the spear mark in his side. He would have seen the lashes across his back. His body was torn to shreds. The Bible said he didn't even appear human after his torture. He would have seen the holes of the crown of thorns on his head. And so no one would have known better how dead Jesus was than Joseph. And so as Joseph is dealing with and cleaning up this broken, bloody body of a guy he respected, Joseph would have known well that Jesus was dead, right? He was killed in the most horrible way the Romans knew how to kill someone. And I just wonder as he prepared Jesus' body, and on top of this, he's not doing a 3-day cloth. He's doing a permanent cloth. He's doing permanent burial rituals here, placing Jesus, rolling the stone. I wonder if he struggled walking away with just kind of giving up on God. Like there was so much hope behind Jesus and who everyone thought he was going to be. And Jesus didn't just lose. He lost in stunning fashion to the wishes of a mob. But have you ever given up on God just a little too soon? I wonder too if there was a moment for Joseph as he's choosing the tomb for Jesus, if he's trying to impress God a little bit. He didn't just select any grave. He selected one that was carved out of stone. This would have been an expensive grave in that day. In fact, the appearance here, he owns this. The suggestion is that it might have been his own personal grave. You know how people sometimes of means or wealth or significance, they have a huge gravestone or something of significance. Well, in that day, if you were wealthy, it would have been a stone tomb. So every indication is that this Supreme Court member, this is his tomb. And he's giving it to Jesus, which was a very generous thing. But I'm wondering if there was anything within Joseph where he's trying to impress God. If he's trying to compensate for what he didn't do when Jesus is alive and now in his death, he's like, well, at least I can give him my best tomb. Have you ever tried to shop for someone for Christmas who's really hard to shop for? I know for me it was my dad, right? Underwear and hankies, that was all we knew to give him. Sometimes socks. That way we didn't know what to give dad, right? Because he always had the tools that he wanted and that sort of thing. You imagine buying something for Jesus? What do you get for someone who owns the world? Come on, right? And so sometimes I think we try to impress God. We try to give him something, and we try to clean ourselves up. And here we're trying to impress the one who has everything already, who has need for nothing. Can you really impress the same God who owns the world and who simply wants you? There's nothing you can do that makes him want you more or accept you more than he already does. I also wonder if maybe Joseph was dealing with a little bit of protection. He had just seen firsthand in his court earlier that day the guilty verdict. There was nothing he could do to protect Jesus. And now in this final act of respect and honor, he puts him in the tomb. He takes this big stone and puts it across. And I wonder if there was a sense of, well, I couldn't protect him in life, but good grief, at least I'm going to protect him a little in death. I couldn't save his body from being torn apart, but I can save now his body from being desecrated. And I'm going to give him a little bit of protection that I couldn't give him while he was alive. It's funny, have you ever thought, man, I need to defend God. I need to protect God. He's been being mistreated. He's whatever. Can you imagine how small-minded we must be if we ever think that God needs our protection? The God who with spoken words created the universe, the God who one day just developed and designed and created with spoken words dinosaurs. Humans, crafted humans, breathed life. That God, do we really think that there's anything we can do to impress or protect him? Now, I want you to see what happened that day as Joseph was going through all this. I want you to see in verse 61 a little side note that Matthew gives us. He says, both Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, these were two of Jesus' friends, were sitting across from the tomb and watching. And I don't know why. I don't know why the two Marys are there still at the graveside service, but there's some reason why they just couldn't leave. And if you've ever been to a funeral, and especially the unexpected death of someone, you know that those who are closest to that person, they often have a lot of trouble leaving that grave, right? And the body gets lowered down into the ground. And as a pastor who's done funerals, I often will stay with the body until it's covered as a sign of respect. And often there's some very broken family members and friends who can't leave either. And that day, here's Mary and Mary. They can't find it in themselves to leave the graveside service. And I don't think we can understand what they feel without knowing what had happened the week before. Just a few days before, 5 days before, Jesus had come into the capital city of Jerusalem with enormous hopes. In fact, he was welcomed as a king by the crowds. It was Palm Sunday. And there was this expectation that Jesus was days away from taking a crown. There was an expectation Jesus was going to overthrow the government of the day. You know how all of us have always wished for our government to get overthrown? I mean, in that day, the government was far worse than ours, and they couldn't wait for someone to step up. And if anyone could do it, it was Jesus. He had literally raised people from the dead. He had healed people. He had done teaching that was miraculous and amazing and powerful. If anyone could do it, it's Jesus. He rides into a king's welcome, and everyone's expecting who follows Jesus. This is the week he gets coronated. This is the week we overthrow our government. And instead, 5 days later, he's dead on a piece of wood. And so kind of the hopes of the nation died that day. And Mary couldn't even leave the graveside service. Look at verse 62. The next day on the Sabbath, the leading priests and Pharisees went to see Pilate. They told him, "Sir, we remember what that deceiver once said." Notice how even Jesus is dead and they're still slandering him. That deceiver once said while he was still alive, "After 3 days, I will rise from the dead. So we request that you seal the tomb until the third day. This will prevent his disciples from coming and stealing his body, and then telling everyone that he was raised from the dead. If that happens, we'll be worse off than we were at first." Pilate replied, "Take guards and secure it the best you can." So they sealed the tomb and posted guards to protect it. Do you notice what they're concerned about? They're not concerned that what Jesus said is going to happen, that he's going to come out of his grave. They're concerned that someone might fake it. There's absolutely no expectation in the record of Scripture that anyone actually thought Jesus was going to walk out of his grave. The expectation was, it was big words, it was great hopes, but they're dead. They're gone. And so even the enemies of Jesus knew he had promised he'd walk out after 3 days, and they're like, hey, let's just make sure no one fakes this. Let's make sure no one steals his body and does something deranged with it and then pretends that he's alive, because then we're in for a mess. So here's what's funny about all this. There's this thing that many followers of Jesus have struggled with for many years, and it's this. We struggle that people will think I'm crazy if I take God at his word. If you really believe that someday Jesus is going to come back, he's going to judge the world with fire, he's going to take every single person, one by one, judge them, send those that have accepted him to heaven, those who haven't to hell. If you really believe that, you're a little kooky. I hope you know this. And so in that day, people who were going to believe what Jesus had said, that in 3 days he was going to walk out of his grave, they would have been considered deranged and crazy. I just want you to know, if you follow Jesus and you believe his promises, you join good company of a bunch of crazy lunatics. The other thing that we struggle with is, well, God doesn't do miracles anymore, right? They're kind of fairy tales and stories from the past. And even Jesus' weekend, the weekend that he died, people were probably thinking, well, he had done a lot of miracles, but a guy who's dead can't do anymore. And there's no one around who's a miracle worker who can bring this dead miracle worker back to life. That's why they're just certain it's over. God doesn't do miracles anymore. And even thousands of years later, there's this struggle that we have as followers. Like, this is great, and we're going to celebrate what God did back there. But he doesn't do that kind of stuff anymore. He doesn't do miracles anymore. And there's another thing that we just realize if we follow Jesus is that we're underdogs. I think on Palm Sunday, the excitement of the followers of Jesus is they felt like the crowd was behind them and momentum was behind them. And 4 days later, 5 days later, the momentum swung the other way and the crowds were against them. And suddenly they went from being on top of the world to being crushed by the world to being afraid, and they were definitely in the underdog category. Vegas had bet against them, and the odds were not in their favor. And the thing with Jesus is he didn't just lose. If you were there that weekend that he was crucified, you would know that he was crushed. I mean, he was mocked. He was tortured. The guy who you felt like could lead an army and overthrow the government is absolutely crushed by a mob and by the Romans. And so there's all this sense of, man, this is over. Jesus' funeral was on Friday. There's no expectation that there's anything else to this story other than defeat and anguish and death. And I can only imagine those who believed Jesus, those who were faithful to Jesus, when they were praying. And I can even imagine Mary. Joseph takes that stone, pulls it in front of the tomb, and walks away. And Mary are there looking at that stone. You imagine praying in that moment? Let me put it this way. Have you ever prayed and felt like you were talking to a wall? You imagine what it was like that day to talk to a stone? Right? Praying and feeling like I'm crazy. I'm talking to someone who's dead. I'm talking to someone that's behind that big stone. What am I thinking? And Satan loves to mess with our sense of fear and guilt and worry. And he's really good at that. But thankfully, the story's not over.